Thank you for joining us. I'm Rakae Jamil. I'm going to be moderating today's session with Dr. Katherine Butler Schofield. And the topic we're going to be discussing is music and the Mughal Twilight. Although that word twilight, I don't feel is, accurate. I think because the kind of work we're doing, we're sort of making it come alive again. So Mughal Twilight, maybe something else, more like a Mughal...
I don't know, evening of magic.
Evening of magic.
Having just attended John Zabricki's session on magic. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. So just a bit about Dr. Katherine Butler Schofield. She's a senior lecturer at King's College on South Asian music and history. She's also a viola player, or used to be a viola player. And the range of topics that she covers is music and the Mughal era, as well as music and South Asia in general, and mostly during that time when the Mughals were exploring this subject in a lot of depth, as well as high culture and the emotions that come along with it. So today, I guess, before we begin talking about the real stuff, I'd just like to ask you, Dr. Katherine, what made you decide to pursue South Asian music and history altogether?
Thank you.
Coming
Thank you
from
so
England.
Much. Yeah. And salam alaikum. It's an absolute pleasure to be here in Lahore, where the great Tansen sadly passed away before he was removed to Gwalior as a great Mughal city. I'm very excited to be here. So what made me get into this in the first place? Well, I went to conservatoire for my undergraduate degree. Goodness, okay. And
quite loud over
yes, so I went to conservatoire to play the viola, and which I loved. And about halfway through my degree, I dropped out because I got a job in an orchestra, which was the summit of my ambition. And I rapidly realized that it really was not for me. I just didn't find it intellectually stimulating largely. And I went back to university to finish my degree in viola. I should have done something else, but I just, as a matter of interest, got really, really interested in the history of the subcontinent, and particularly the history of the Muslim peoples of the subcontinent, and I was interested in textiles and architecture and calligraphy, and at that point I couldn't read it, but I still thought it was beautiful, and I started listening to Hindustani, Pakistani classical music. And I discovered that here you have a world where it is just as difficult, just as beautiful, just as virtuosic as Western classical music, but it is you, the performer, who is the creator of the music. But I also realized that, as I was now in my early 20s, that there was no way I was going to be a performer. But I just loved the history of it, and I particularly loved Mughal history. So I went to SOAS, and I did a master's degree and then a PhD in the history of classical music in Mughal Indian subcontinent. And that's the it, really. And I think probably, the answer as to why I keep doing it is love. I love the Mughal world, and I love what remains of its music, because of course we can't hear its sound. The sound's gone.
Yeah, it's fortunate.
But that's actually part of the poignancy and the beauty of it, that we can't hear it.
True,
Odd,
true.
I know.
I think open to interpretation for all of us.
Yeah.
And you also learned Farsi yourself, and you're able to speak a bit of it as well as Urdu.
Yeah.
And
So my spoken languages are
wow.
horrible. Meri Urdu bahut kharab hai. But I read Persian quite well. So I studied Persian at SOAS, which was a great place to study it. Yeah.
Awesome.
So most of my work is reading Persian texts on music in the Mughal world.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I think today what we would like to discuss is that era between Aurangzeb and Bahadur Shah Zafar, those two emperors. But I'd like to mention a few articles that Dr. Katherine has written. One is Words Without Songs, the social history of Hindustani song collections in India's Muslim courts. Then there's the next one, which we're probably going to try and focus on extensively. It's Did Aurangzeb ban music? Questions for the historiography of his reign. And that's another essay. Then the chief musicians to the Mughal emperors, the Delhi Kalavants, Bradri, 17th to 19th centuries. She also does podcasts. There's one on SoundCloud called The Orpheus of Delhi, for which I contributed a little music segment on the Surbahar for it. And I do urge all of you to do have a look at these articles if they're available online. Yes?
Yes, they are.
They're quite eye-opening for me, being a student of South Asian music and history, and also someone who's pursuing the more whimsical, subjective side with Mughal Funk, the band that I'm
And if I
heading.
can just add to that, so the Orpheus of Delhi podcast, which is on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Google Play, is part of a series of podcasts which I've been doing.
Right.
Focuses on a story from the War of Succession between the man who would become Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, Alamgir I, and his brother Dara Shikoh, who need no introduction to this audience. And there's this story in the middle of this about Aurangzeb's, or Shah Jahan's chief musician, Khushal Khan Guna Samudra, the ocean of virtue, where he puts Shah Jahan into a trance by singing Rag Bilas Khani Thori. And into such a trance that Shah Jahan signs a piece of paper which seals his fate to be usurped by Aurangzeb. So if you want to know more about that, you have to listen to the Orpheus of Delhi. But I was looking for recordings of Bilas Khani Thori, which would reflect the instrument that was the main classical instrument at the time, the bean or rudravina, which of course is not played very often right now. And I came across this man's beautiful recording of Bilas Khani Thori on the Surbahar, which was just perfect to evoke this sound world. And of course, the sound world is not what it would have sounded like then. We can never ever recapture that, but it was an imaginative recreation of the feelings, the emotions of this rag, which are still the same today as, in some sense, as they were then, and to accompany this amazing story. So he put me into a trance.
It was a pleasure.
with his Bilas Khani Thori.
Thank you. No, I'm glad. I think that's the pull of our music is that, no matter which culture you belong to, it's always going to somehow penetrate your mind, your heart in more ways than often. And I think as a musician, it's our job to make everyone else realize that. And I think that during the Mughal era, during the Muslim period as well, you find that music was extensively explored in that sense in many aspects. But coming back to our topic now, I feel like we all thought Aurangzeb was or most of us, a sort of villain when it comes to high culture, right? And music and the arts in the subcontinent. So we'd like to understand and how you're going to set the record straight here.
Okay, so
how is it that Aurangzeb was not against music, was not against all the cultural heritage of our past?
Sure. Okay. So the first thing to say is that I wrote this article called "Did Aurangzeb Ban Music?" The answer to which is, in fact, no. Two things to say. This does not mean that he was a nice man. There were plenty of horrible people in history. Hitler, for example, who was famous for his love of Wagner, who loved music. So this does not exculpate Aurangzeb. But it is a fact that not only did he not ban music, he actually loved music. Do you need to go up? Louder?
Yeah, I think.
Louder, okay. He had this famous love for a courtesan whose name was Hirabai Zainabadi, whom he met in 1653 in Burhanpur. And he was so in love with her singing and her dancing and her beauty that he had to have her. And she was in the court of his uncle. And at one point, such was his love for this woman that she teased him and said, "Will you drink a glass of wine?" And he nearly did, but she stopped him from doing it because she knew that that would, make him feel terrible. And very, very sadly, she died 9 months after they met. And that's actually obviously quite a poignant number of months. There's no suggestion that there was a baby, but 9 months is indicative. And on the day of her death, he was so distraught that he went out into the desert with just one friend, his bosom friend, and they went hunting. And he just took his friend and his hawk and his horse. And his friend said, "Well, why are we hunting? Why are we not, sort of back at court mourning?" And he wrote these lines. He said, "Laments at home comfort not the heart. In the desert, one can weep one's fill." So he's on record as patronizing music for at least the first 10 years of his reign. And also, there were a large number of music treatises written for him, not just in the 1660s in the first 10 years of his reign, but right through his life, including a really important one written in 1698 by the man who was still the chief musician of the Mughal atelier, Rasparas Khan Kalawant, the son of Khushal Khan Kalawant, Guna Samudra, and a direct descendant of Tansen. And he spends the first several pages with this great big encomium of praise to Aurangzeb, who is clearly still his patron. However, in 1668, Aurangzeb turned 50 in solar years, and the solar calendar was still important to the Mughals at this time. And 50 at that time was actually really quite an advanced age for a man. And that's a point at which you start thinking about the hereafter and about your legacy here on earth. And of course, he had usurped his father violently and locked his father up until his father died in 1666, 2 years later. Shah Jahan, his father Shah Jahan. And, this was a sin. And he started thinking about, what is the Almighty going to think of my deeds on earth? And so, despite the fact that he loved music very much, and I've got another quote from him actually about that, what he said about music specifically. In fact, because he loved it so much, it was a distraction to him. It was a distraction to him as a ruler, and particularly as a pious Muslim king. He decided that that was one of the things he would renounce in 1668 for the rest of his life. But he still he wrote to his sons as late as the 1690s saying, "My father Shah Jahan listened to the qawwals in the evening. You should do the same thing." And his official pronouncement in one of the historical chronicles, which was written late, very late in his reign, not very late, middle, 1684. So somebody asked him, "What is your opinion, Your Majesty, on music?" And he said, "Music is permissible, mubah. Neither good nor bad." And then his courtier said, "So what, in your opinion, then, is most worthy to be listened to?" And Aurangzeb replied, "I cannot listen to music without instruments, especially pakawich." So he loved the pakawich. He loved drupad. But instruments are prohibited, as they are in some interpretations of the law. So I have left off hearing singing too.
Pakawich, let me explain. For some of you who don't know what it is, it's basically, आप लोगों को सब तबला का तो पता ही है, but pakawich is actually one, whole drum. इसमें you play it like a dholak,
Ji.
but it's much heavier sound.
Yeah.
Definitely much. And that instrument used to accompany Drupad music. Right.
Yes. And some of you may be familiar with the Talwandi Gharana here in Pakistan, who are experts in the Drupad tradition. So, yes. So, this obviously would have had a symbolic impact upon people who were aware of Aurangzeb's tendencies. And music cuts to the heart of what people are and who people are. And one of the treatise writers of Aurangzeb's reign wrote about music. The question is, what is music for? And Faqirullah Saif Khan wrote, music's purpose is to arouse tender sympathies and feelings in the heart. That is music's entire essence and its result. So that is what music is to arouse tender sympathies in the heart. And it's also its result on the listener. And that was incredibly important to Mughal noblemen because to them that was a way of helping them to balance out their emotions so that they had the kind of equilibrium required in Unani medical thought to carry out their duties as a ruler. So music was actually this essential medicine to help you to carry out your worldly duty. So, of course, any kind of suggestion that music might be under threat, even if it's just the emperor saying, I don't mind even if my sons listen to music, but I'm not going to do it anymore, is going to be alarming to people. But the other thing that it does is that it means that taste becomes a little bit more distributed, a little bit more diffuse. The emperor was the arbiter of everything that was best in the classical art forms. And his taste went. So Akbar loved Tansen and Tansen's music, so Drupad becomes the music of the Mughal court under Akbar. Aurangzeb says, I'm not going to involve myself in cultural affairs. I am abdicating as the king of culture. So he passes the mantle on to other people, to the royal princes, and particularly Muhammad Azam Shah, who was a very well-known poet and lyricist in Braj the language that eventually became Hindi, and to other Mughal noblemen. So his prime minister was famous for his love of music, to some of the Rajput Mansabdars, particularly the Rajas of Udaipur and Bikaner. And so you begin to get a bit of a diffusion of taste going on.
Right. Also, the fact that Mughal emperors were they all led very controversial lives. So it's obvious that people who wrote about him during that time, it could have been that he rubbed them the wrong way.
Absolutely.
And, but I feel like there were some instances where you find not just one author, but a couple of authors who sort of make the claim that Aurangzeb tried to suppress music in terms of its prolificness or the way it was practiced back before his reign began, its openness. Was there any refute to that in terms of evidence?
There's really no evidence for its suppression anywhere other than in the hearing of the emperor himself.
Right.
And we're talking specifically about courtly music here. He still allowed himself to listen to qawwals when it was not accompanied with instruments.
Yeah.
And we have evidence of that. We even have evidence of the Hindu festival of Holi being celebrated with concerts in the Mughal camp. And if you know anything about tents, music passes straight through tents. So it's hard to imagine that he would not have heard these concerts. Coming from his, chief noblemen who are close to his quarters.
Right.
Yes, there just really isn't any evidence outside one or two stories of the time, and it's important that these were stories that were around in his reign of him banning everything and destroying instruments and so on. There just isn't any evidence, all the other evidence of which there's a huge amount, not just in Persian sources but also in European sources, that people just carried on as normal.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's that. The record is set straight, so to speak.
Oh, I'm sure this will continue to go on and on.
Yeah, the debate is always there, but I feel like, so obviously it makes sense that following his reign, his rule, I mean, you still have a very strong tradition of music taking place in the subcontinent. You have a variety of musical forms being established, Dhrupad being probably the first and foremost of them. And then following that, of course, you have Qawwali, which dates back to Amir Khusro's time, but also Khayal Kaiki, right? Which, although its roots were before that Aurangzeb's time, but you have two very known personalities by the name of Sadarang and Adarang, who were there during the time of Muhammad Shah Rangile's reign.
Yeah.
So would you care to elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, sure.
You know.
Yeah, so actually, threats to a tradition don't necessarily destroy it. They can cause it to thrive, to be resilient, to change into new things.
Yeah.
When Aurangzeb died in 1707, the whole place the whole Mughal Empire was thrown into chaos because he had been a very long-lived emperor. He was nearly 90 when he died, and he'd spent 30 years fighting wars in the Deccan to try to control the whole place. And things had been crumbling and falling apart at the seams, and various people had been rebelling. There was a major Rajput rebellion in the 80s and so forth. And so when he died, the empire began to fall apart. And you have this series of really terrible emperors. Bahadur Shah the first, Shah Alam the first, he was all right, but he was really old himself, and he died within 5 years. The next emperor, Jahandar Shah, raised his chief consort, who was from a Kalawant family and a courtesan, to be the chief queen of the empire.
Right.
And within a year, his noblemen had risen up against him and assassinated him and thrown his body down the stairs and locked her up for the rest of her life.
Wow.
So we'll just skip over the period between 1707 and 1720. In 1720, a young man called Muhammad Shah finally succeeds in making it onto the throne with the help of a very powerful set of noblemen who he then was successful in removing from their power. He was actually, quite a good ruler. And at this point, 1720 to 48, 1720 to 39, taxes are still being remitted back to the centre from the big states of Bengal, of Punjab, of Hyderabad, and so forth. So there's still money there, and there's still some semblance of geopolitical power. What Muhammad Shah does with that money is he creates this amazing palace of music, dance, art, and sponsors musicians like Niamat Khan Sadarang, who was his first patron was Aurangzeb's son, Muhammad Azam Shah, in the late 17th century. And he learnt khayal from a qawwal called Tatari qawwal in the late 17th century. And what he did with khayal is he took his own Dhrupad lineage traditions and merged it with khayal to make this really kind of serious, a more serious khayal genre, which he then taught everybody at the court, and taught it to his nephew, Firoz Khan Adarang, and various other people. So this is an exciting time for khayal. And some of Sadarang's bandishes, of course, are still in the repertoire. So this is the period that we remember because of the longevity of these traditions. There are some bandishes still in the tradition from earlier, but it's really him who's the first celebrity musician, really.
Right.
And he was also a famous Sufi, and he would perform every month at the shrine of Shah Gulshan. But his nephew is the first. Firoz Khan Adarang was famous as a khayal composer,
Exponent, yeah.
but he's the first a person who became, famous for playing the sitar.
For playing the sitar.
Yes. And so you still have what's called Firoz Khani guts and budge in the sitar tradition today that date back to the reign of Muhammad Shah Rangila.
Wow.
And another instrument that suddenly comes out of the shadows at this time is the tabla. So the tabla was unknown in classical music performance until this point. And we were talking about the pakawaj before.
Yeah.
And this is the point at which the tabla displaces the pakawaj. And the first paintings of tabla are from Punjab and were painted by the famous painter Nain Sukh. So you should be proud. Tabla is from here. So you have all these innovations which are facilitated partly by the money that's around, but also by the fact that there's been a bit of chaos beforehand, which has changed the parameters of
Right.
patronage and form and so on.
I think it's quite common that out of chaos, a lot of beauty comes out as well. But I guess looking at the socio-political side of things, I think it's fascinating to see how the rulers and the musicians had so much mutual respect for each other, and there was a lot of depth in that relationship. Whether you look at Akbar and Tansen, or Muhammad Shah Rangile and
Sadarang and
Sadarang and Adarang, there was a lot of exchange going on. Something that we don't really see happening in today's times, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I feel like, are there any parallels that we can draw in current times vis-a-vis concerning the political, social climate and music in comparison to, the Mughal era?
Yeah, I mean it's a really good question, and I think that the point to make is that patronage does matter a huge amount, and the type of patronage that happens matters a huge amount. So whether there's a lot of state patronage of music, or whether it's all left to private individuals, does make a difference. It makes a difference in terms of quantity. It makes a difference in terms of quality. But it's not necessarily, this is the takeaway point, it's not necessarily the thing you would think. You'd think a lot of money around, a lot of state patronage leads to a lot of great music. Actually, it's often the other way around, because that can just lead to stultifying conservatism. Whereas sometimes when things are a little bit more difficult, you get new flowers blooming.
Right.
Yeah.
Which leads us now to that time in history when the British come during the 19th century, right? Yeah. And the Mughal Empires in its, well, at least its power as a political agency sort of dwindles with Bahadur Shah Zafar II. Yeah. I guess that's a time when the Gharana system sort of emerges strong, and you have all these musicians dispersing throughout, the subcontinent, Gwalior, Patiala, Delhi, Jaipur. And so you have a birth of new musical styles emerging, but at the same time, there's sort of like a break in terms of community, right? You have emerging styles, and the only way for musicians from different gharanas to share music with each other was if there was someone who offered their daughter's hand in marriage or son's hand in marriage, and in the dowry they would exchange bandishes, compositions. It was quite interesting. But I feel like, like you said, things, a lot of different kinds of music bloomed from that. But do you think that things would have been different had these foreign influences not come about?
Yeah. I mean, undoubtedly, yes.
In terms of
Yeah.
the music and the way it was
Yes.
practiced.
So, I mean, I think we would have seen a completely different set of. I mean, it's very hard to do this kind of counterfactual history, but I think we would have seen just a completely different set of people
Right.
as the key performers in Pakistan and India, I mean, the key break comes much later. It's at the end. It's the uprising of 1857, and then the devastating aftermath of that, which I'll get to. But there's this long period between of invasions, wars. People just scattering everywhere. So the period I've been looking at in the last year, and this series of talks and podcasts I've been given, is the period from Nader Shah's invasion of Delhi, where he sacked the city and took the peacock throne away and tried to massacre the population in 1739, and the uprising in 1858 when the British depose and exiled the last Mughal emperor, who was a great connoisseur and poet, Bahadur Shah Zafar, to Rangoon for the rest of his natural life. The writers of the time, the people who wrote about music, actually referred to this period as the scattering of Shah Jahanabad. So they had this I have to apologize, they had this very Delhi-centric vision. And so what happens in this period, one of the reasons we know the stories of the lives of Sadarang and Adarang and Tansen and all these people is because they started being written down after 1750. Right. First in 1753, because these people who were writing about music were so concerned by everybody dying and being forced into exile and so forth, that they thought, well, if I can't go down the road and say, Uncle Jafar, I can't remember how we're related to Tansen, and Uncle Jafar, goes back in his memory and says, well, orally this isn't right. Or if you can no longer go down the road and say, Uncle Jafar, I have forgotten the second verse, I've forgotten the antara to this Drupad song, can you please remind me? Because Uncle Jafar is in retirement at a Sufi shrine in Delhi, and you are in Hyderabad. What do you have to do? You have to write it down. So they wrote down the stories of their families, and they started to write down their compositions. So we now, at this point, have compositions that we can refer back to and maybe even recreate, because they have rag, they have tal, they have lyrics, and sometimes they even have sargam, which is exciting. So they start writing these things down, and they are just, so this is something that often my students don't understand. Dr. Schofield, why are you so obsessed with genealogy and the genealogy of these musicians? And it's because it's an orally transmitted tradition. Exactly. And lineage is everything in that situation. The music is in the blood of these people. These were closed shop guilds. And they didn't teach anybody outside the family. And as you said, if their tradition was threatened because there wasn't a good enough son to carry on the tradition, they would marry their daughters into another lineage and say, and then I will give you these bandages as dowry, or these rags. There's a brief period just before 1858 when the British take Delhi in 1803 and sort of set themselves up effectively as the rulers. And by this point, Delhi has shrunk to the environs. So the Mughal Empire has shrunk to the environs of Delhi, in which new stars emerge. You've probably all heard of Tanras Khan, the last great khayal singer, and who was also belongs to the Qawwal tradition. And of the last great bean player, Mian Himmat Khan, and there's a beautiful painting of him in the British Library. So enough of a celebrity to have this beautiful painting of him. But the uprising happens in 1857. It starts as a rebellion by disgruntled soldiers who are being told that when they tear the cartridges with which they fire their guns, they are having to put in their mouths pig fat and beef fat,
Wow.
which was offensive, deeply offensive, and to everybody. Everybody would lose their families, they would lose their caste if they were Hindu, and just horrendous. And the rumors were probably true, actually. And so there's an uprising that rapidly turns into a massive civilian uprising. The British nearly lost the whole of the British possessions in India. And what they did to Delhi and Lucknow, so Delhi and Lucknow held out under siege for a long time, and when the siege was broken, the British soldiers went in and they killed every man they could find, and they raped every woman they could find. And the Lal Qila in Shah Jahanabad, the Red Fort, they tore its walls down. They stabled their horses in the Moti Masjid as an overt act of offense. And they exiled all Muslim inhabitants of Delhi from the city for 5 years after the uprising. Wow. So what happens, that's a real break. If the music is in the blood, and not just the blood of musicians, but listeners as well, because you have this long tradition of listeners becoming disciples of musicians and of becoming great patrons of musicians, and it's a family tradition to be a patron.
Exactly.
If you kill them all, if you exile the musicians and listeners, if they are forced to travel long distances to find a safe place that has not been ravaged, usually somewhere which sided with the British, like Rampur, then there is going to be a dramatic break in the tradition, and that's what happens. Yeah. So the remnants of these lineages form into today's Quranas as an act of saving the tradition from destruction. And so some people, consider the Quranas to be moribund and stuffy and conservative forces in today's musical world, but at the time they were an absolute necessity. And what's nice is that you can actually trace some of the musicians from before the uprising, through the uprising, and into these new places. So if you look at Kapurthala and the court of Kapurthala in Punjab, the last bean player of Bahadur Shah Zafar was a man called Mir Nasir Ahmad. And his father was a Sayyid, but he'd been married into the family and taken on as his ancestor's chief disciple. And he was caught up after the British captured Delhi, and he was in danger of being summarily executed as a collaborator and a close confidant of Bahadur Shah Zafar, because he was in this relationship with the king, between the king and the musician. He was a close confidant of Bahadur Shah Zafar, the emperor. And it was only when the brother of the Raja of Kapurthala stepped in and said, stop, this man is just a musician, even though his father was a Sayyid. He's just a musician, don't kill him. That the British said, oh, okay, well, you can have this man. And he took him back to Kapurthala, where he then trained generations of new disciples, took some of his own family with him, and of course the Rajas of Kapurthala also trained with him as disciples, and were his patrons. And that's where you get, Qurana in Kapurthala from, which is lovely.
Wow, thank you for that important information. I feel like in Pakistan's history, you find that there are several personalities in the arts, in poetry, who have, sort of been accused of the same. And it's like, things aren't really different in terms of those dynamics. Last question before we hand it over to the audience here. I feel like it's important for us as students of music to understand and research. What were the primary sources or the secondary sources of your research? And because it's something that all of us struggle with when it comes to research on Pakistani music, because there's a lot of loopholes. It's an oral tradition, right? Rag music, it's a completely oral tradition. So if you want to trace something historical or, find out facts or be as objective as possible? How do you, what were your sources?
It's a really good question.
Yeah.
So there are two blocks to the kind of study that I do, and they're both actually in our heads. The first is the tradition that the ustads were illiterate, and if the ustads were illiterate, then they didn't write anything down. And if they didn't write anything down, there's nothing there to act as a historical source. And that is just simply not true. The ustads were not illiterate, and a number of them actually wrote music treatises or wrote their songs down. And it's just a matter of opening our minds and saying, well, if they did write, what is out there? And it turns out that there are literally hundreds of manuscripts from this period on music, on musicians, largely in Persian, also in Braj Pasha, and then later in Rekhta, which became Urdu, and then after 1858, modern South Asian languages, Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, Punjabi, Gujarati, etc., published. And these are actually increasingly becoming available digitally. So you might even come across the odd music treatise on something like archive.org if you're interested in the Urdu.
Archive.org?
Archive.org. So there are at least 12 major music treatises written in Urdu and published between 1862 and the end of the 19th century. Right. A number of them here in Lahore. So there's just a huge number of sources, and if you read Persian, if you read Urdu, if you read these languages, there's just a world out there. It's just endless, wow. And we keep coming across more and more all the time. That's the first thing. The second thing is more difficult to deal with, and so there's a beautiful quote by a Mughal writer called Sheikh Khan Lodi, who wrote in a Tazkira, collected biographies of poets in 1691. He wrote, "It is impossible to capture the essence of music in pen and ink on the surface of the page. All we are left with are the sibilant scratches of a broken pen." So it is impossible to capture music in writing. Sure. And this is even true when you've got a really good notation system, like a Western musical score, because the score doesn't tell you what it was like to be there in that room while those musicians played. And it's particularly true of a tradition that's largely improvised. Yeah. So the question then becomes, what can you recover? Which is why your Mughal Funk project is so interesting, because can you tell us a little bit about how you're trying to solve this question?
I think I need help with that from one of my bandmates here, Mr. Kami Paul, who's there. But I think we came up with the music first. I think it was more an organic process where Kami, me, and two of our other bandmates, Rufus on the keys and Farhan on the bass, we decided to get together and just make music. And the idea of having a sitar amongst Western group of instruments or more modern, contemporary, that gave it a little sort of edge of, let's try to mix it up a bit, make it traditional, South Asian along with, Western, jazz and funk elements. I think the concept of bringing the Mughals in came after we tried to incorporate, there was a composition which was based loosely on Rag Miyan Ki Malhar.
Beautiful.
Which was a rag that was composed by Tansen, Miyan Tansen during Akbar's reign. And I think that composition sort of sparked this idea, okay, let's make it about that, because we were all inspired by that time, whether it's the extravagant living of the Mughals and the various stories that are associated with them, the colorful personalities, the deception, the hypocrisy, the human element in them, the fact that, now Aurangzeb's love for Hirabai, which I discovered from your writing. All these stories sort of inspired us to sort of interpret that musically. I guess that's how it came about. And our first album, I'm just going to show it here, which I'm going to give to you.
Yes.
It's right here, and it's 6 tracks based on the names of the Mughal emperors. Mughal emperors we felt were, the stories we could connect to. But we're still exploring this concept. We're going to look at the events. We're going to look at other things that have happened during that time, and we're going to try to draw parallels with it today and try to contemporize those stories in today's times.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So,
and I think there's something about emotional truth that is in music that's not necessarily articulable in discussion or writing or whatever.
Yeah, words.
But the thing about emotional truth is that that's there in the stories as well, and you can match that with modern music and be truthful to the emotional truths in a way that actually really sings for modern audiences, I think.
Exactly. I think it's important that we just be true to what we can do and then, express it in the best way possible, right? I feel like as musicians and, that's honesty is the best policy.
Absolutely.
I feel. But thank you, Dr. Katherine. I'm going to hand it over now to the audience, and we have a very colorful audience here today. We have, as I mentioned, Kami Paul there on the drums, a drummer. We have Kuratulen Baloch sitting in front, and she's one of Pakistan's leading vocalists, and she's awesome.
I'm honored to be
I'm
in the room
expecting
with
some
these
good
people.
questions from the audience, and we have some scholars here as well, some young scholars. Sorry, yeah. Do we have a mic for him? Also filmmakers, to my right, Rajat Nabi, and actresses, Sami Altaf.
During the Mughal time period,
Yeah.
are there certain instruments or certain rags that were really popular from the city of Lahore?
That is a very good question. The city of Lahore was a Mughal city, and in this period, and the favorite city, as far as we know, of the Emperor Jahangir. And he inherited the great rags of his father, Akbar, and a real love for those. Rag Thori, Rag Miyanki Malhar, Rag Bhairav was the big rag that started every, Rag Malconche, with which singers, if they sing it correctly at the right time at midnight, can raise the jinns. And there's actually even a record in his memoirs of a majlis held in the palace where the qawwals came and sang Qol and Tarana, and somebody actually was so inspired by the music that they dropped dead and so then of course everybody remembered the stories about the great Sufi saint Hazrat Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki, who also attained his final rest during a Sama session of listening to spiritual recitation. So there's that. And slightly later on, we've got really good. There's a really nice section in a Tazkira, one of these collective biographies I've been looking at about the qawwals of Lahore. And I'll read a little bit of one of these because I brought this along just in case, and so I just translated this today. So it might not be the best translation, but there's a section on the life stories of qawwals who came from Lahore and Multan and Sirhind to Delhi. Again, it's a very Delhi-centric text. Some sang khayal in the language of Punjab and others in the language of Delhi. They all became famous. The first among the qawwals of Lahore was Hibba Qawwal, who was favored by Khaja Jafar, the elder brother of Khan Doran, who was very important in the reign of Muhammad Shah. And Khaja Jafar himself was a faqir who held a famous discussion with Sheikh Abdullah of Multan on the virtues of asceticism and the Sufi masters. And that famous discussion happened in 1716. Hiba Qawwal, his voice was powerful and high, and he sang qiyal and Persian ghazals and Punjabi dohras. He always took permission from Khaja Jafar's son, Khaja Muhammad Basit, to attend Sufi majalis, Sufi gatherings. Hiba Qawwal also played the barbat well. He dressed in an old-fashioned style and later in life became mentally ill and sat at the entrance of Khaja Jafar's dargah, which was outside Turkoman Gate in Delhi, and said alarming and fantastical things. After some years, he passed away still in this condition. So that was Hiba Qawwal, and there's a bunch of other qawwals of Lahore in this text. So, but this is a text which is marking this, what the author calls the scattering of Shah Jahan about 1785, and he's trying to keep tabs on everybody and who they were and where they came from and where they went to. And so his vision extends to Lahore, which is nice.
Can I have a question? Rakae? Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the fantastic talk. I was just wondering that whenever it comes to women, it's always the dancing girls in the courts. Are there any, did you find any, like, I think there's some work is being done on Mahalaka by...
That's right.
Yeah. But any other singers, players, musicians, female in the Mughal court?
So we don't, so Malaka Bai Chanda, who was a famous courtesan at the court of Hyderabad, and she's also famous, she was famous in European circles as well because she gave her diwan of ghazals to the resident of Hyderabad, John Malcolm, in the middle of her dancing. So there he was at a party at which she was the star, and she danced up to him and presented him with her ghazals. And it's in the British Library, so you can go and look at it. And it's actually, I think they've digitized it, so you can even look at it online, which is great. But she's the first known courtesan, tawaif, to write a divan of ghazals. I'm sure, or for it to have survived. I'm sure there were more. And there are actually some great collective biographies, again, for the 19th century, which name a large number of women poets, a number of whom were Sharif women, but some of whom were tawaif. So for the 19th century, we have those. But we do have good records of named women performers throughout this period. So the infamous Lal Kanwar, the chief consort of Jahandar Shah, we've got good records for her, and of Nurbai, who was the great courtesan at the court of Muhammad Shah, and Nadir Shah wanted to take her back to Iran with him when he invaded, and she refused famously to go with him. And there's if you have a look at the podcasts I've been doing, there's actually two on courtesans. One is called The Courtesan and the Memsab, which is about a relationship between an English woman called Mrs. Sophia Plowden and a courtesan in Lucknow called Khanam Jan, who was also famous in European and North Indian circles. And we can actually recreate her music because Mrs. Plowden wrote down her songs in Western notation. So we actually have the notation and wrote down the lyrics as well. Her Munshi wrote down the lyrics because they're in Nastaliq. And of course, it's not what it would have sounded like then. We can't recover that. And of course, it's weird. You know, the transcription is weird because they couldn't hear any rhythms that weren't very square and, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, maybe 1, 2, 3, because they could waltz. But anything else, 7? No.
15.
So, yeah.
That's on SoundCloud as well?
Yes, and that's on SoundCloud as well. Yeah. This one.
I would just like to add a short comment regarding the last discussion we had before the question answer session. The question regarding preserving the oral tradition of Indian classical music, Khaja Khurshid Anwar, who was one of the pioneering musical composers associated with Pakistani music industries, was concerned that the exact ways of rendering ragas was very important. So what he did was collaborate with EMI, then
Yeah.
a household company in Pakistan, and in it there are foremost classical vocalists like Roshan Ara Begum, Ustad Salamat Ali Khan, Ustad Fateh Ali Khan, rendered specific ragas, and there was an introduction before each raga.
Yes, is this the Ragmala
Yeah,
series? Yes,
yeah.
I have all of them, yeah.
And it's a fascinating collection of 10 volumes, and
Yeah.
I feel it's a treasure trove for the entire subcontinent.
Yep.
Because before that, there were recordings separately, but there wasn't a systematic framework in which the maestros of the great classical musicians had rendered ragas and with introductions.
That's
So
absolutely true.
believe
And that collection, this Ragamala collection, you can actually, it's now available in a digital form,
Yes.
and it's absolutely beautiful, not least because the person who introduces, and I'm afraid I forget his name, has the most beautiful Urdu. So that's worth listening to, just the sound of his voice as well. So, but thank you for that, and that's true. And we're actually lucky at this point that we do have well over a century of recorded music,
yeah.
so that we can
Thank
actually
God for the
hear.
microphone,
Well,
yeah.
exactly. We can hear how Rag sounded
gramophone, yeah.
100 years ago.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question as an educator. I think what the conversations that's just happened in the last hour is fascinating. Over the past, I think, almost 18 years, we've had musicology emerge as a proper field. And we have it in our several universities. But what I think we desperately need is this kind of synergy between a university, somebody like yourself, and musicologists in Pakistan. And I know so much is happening in terms of collaboration across universities. For example, British Council is leading that. The governments are quite open, British government. And
Yeah.
would there be a possibility at all to think of this kind of sharing of thinking, research practices, etc.,
Yeah.
across universities from where you come and the universities that are
Yeah.
here? Is there anything in the planning?
Yeah,
phases
absolutely.
at all?
And I think this is actually one of the most vital things, is the question of educating and educating younger people as well, and schools and so on. And I mean, a lot of the issues are that these are often agreements that have to happen, sort of really quite high up in institutions, and very often music is not seen as particularly a priority.
Academic priority.
Yes, and actually, in England at the moment, in England and Wales, unfortunately, music in schools has been really downgraded by the current government. And so in a number of secondary schools, I mean, forget having teachers to teach A-level, for students who want to go to university to study music at a place like King's College London, where I work. They don't even have music teachers in secondary schools at all. So these children are missing out on the opportunities to study music at a higher level. So I don't want to be too negative, but I think actually this is a really important thing to do, and it's a conversation I'd love to be involved in. So, yeah.
Totally. One more question?
Sorry, I just had a quick follow-up on what the other gentleman was saying. You mentioned that the Ragmala is online. I think you can find it at sarangi.info. They have the full collection you can download and listen.
Yeah.
And incidentally, he was my grandfather, Khurshid Anwar.
Wow.
So I never got to meet him, but for me, listening to that was a way to learn.
To connect with
him and also
with
learn.
him
I think it's
too.
good for beginners as well as.
Oh, it's
as
absolutely, it's a
people with more
brilliant
knowledge.
resource. I make my students listen to it.
Yeah.
But I feel like, in the end, all roads lead to practice.
Gee.
And you can't escape that. That's like, whether it's 10 hours a day or 6 hours a day, it has to be, that's a prerequisite to become a proper musician, I feel.
Absolutely.
And you being an instrumentalist, me being an instrumental, I think that's,
it's all there.
and no matter how many sources you have for learning music, in the end, it's all about
And there's no substitute for it, really.
right to it. Yeah. Any
Great.
more questions? Please. Yeah. It is quite fascinating.
After Aurangzeb, what she has mentioned is so much information over
Yes.
there.
Yes.
The history especially.
Yes.
And I remember reading about Nader Shah and that lady. Do you remember the verse? I just remember Nadare Vasal Yaram, something like that.
Yeah.
Do you remember that verse?
And I don't remember it, I'm sorry.
It's something
yeah.
that she's saying that Nader Shah says, come with me, and she said, I can't do it because I have this one as well as this one.
Ah,
so
lovely,
I can't.
yeah.
It's some Nadare Vasal Yaram, something like that.
I will have to look it up, yes. And it's at this point that I have to thank the European Research Council and the British Academy for funding my research over the last
But
7 years. So,
what's your opinion about the drums that they played yesterday? I couldn't hear a word what Faizan was I couldn't understand a word what Faizan was singing. Sorry. I have to say that.
yes. Well, I'm afraid I can't comment because I was actually
I think
not
it's,
there. So.
we have a long way to go in terms of being able to manage sound. No, not just for the drums, but you see the halls are not designed for music
Yeah.
primarily.
Yeah.
So, when you go abroad, when you attend concerts, they're usually performed in a space which is designed acoustically
Yeah.
to accommodate instruments, whether they're drums, whether it's violins, whether it's a whole orchestra. So that's something that we also have to look into
Yeah.
as musicians, as
Yeah.
sound engineers
Yeah.
in Pakistan.
Yeah.
And I think that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, Dr. Katherine,
Thank
for
you, and
being with
thank
us.
you.
And I hope we get to see you again soon.
I hope so too.